Hello, this is Odomne, and you're on the YouTube channel of the internet's most notorious ginger man, Thorin.
As the NA or LCS region continues to flounder with all the teams failing to make it out of the group stage into the playoff bracket at Worlds, whereas you contrast that with LEC, the top two LEC teams have already made the top 8. People potentially imagine maybe one of them could go even further. And again, we have this year with the results internationally way more skewed towards the LEC team. Now, I'm not doing that thing that everyone else has been doing for the last 2 years, where you overblow the narrative that, like, regionally, LEC is like the best region, or it's like neck and neck between them and China, or maybe Korea. Like, personally, I think even that is actually completely overblown, and that it's just that G2 was the best team for most of last year, and people took, like, G2 is the best in Europe, therefore Europe's the best. Like, no, I never saw anything from the other European teams, quite frankly, to justify that. Like, but with that said, another factor that plays into that, what people were doing there with G2, is people take the absolute best teams in a region and they make it that team, like, represents as the champion of the region, and therefore, like, they're indicative of how strong the region is. Their results suggest how other teams in the region would do, and oftentimes, since we're talking about the absolute best, they can be an outlier like G2 was. So similarly, I think also in the NA region, people look only at their top teams and draw these big conclusions. So what I thought I would do, though, to actually contrast the two regions, LEC and LCS, and show how badly LCS is doing in terms of its domestic talent, because obviously import rules means they can only have so many good Koreans, Europeans. I mean, they don't really have Chinese players now, but in the past they did LMQ. They can only have so many of those, so it's the native talent that's holding them back, because they've got some very good import players. Like Cordia J is as good as anyone who plays in LEC. Players like Jensen, Bjergsen, when they're at their peak. Doublelift can be as good as the LEC players, but it's the others, it's the supporting cast that don't make it. So what I thought we would do is this. Since the LEC region, the one thing you can't argue, where they contrast very favourably to LCS, is the raw talent spread across the whole region, the whole league. Because LEC as a league is stacked with talent now, especially because of those ERLs, the European regional leagues, that developed a whole bunch of names that in the last, say, 2 years have heavily come to proliferate throughout LEC and make up the top LEC teams. Look at some of the teams going to Worlds or even contesting to go for Worlds. So many rookies from this year or last year, newer names. There are way less of those, like, recycled names that people just gamble on because they've got a nice baseline level. The basement of where they're going to perform is always going to be solid and they're experienced, but what they're ignoring is the ceiling isn't very high anymore. And so as a result, if this was LCS, people like my boy Freeze, who's still a very competent AD carry, he'd definitely be in the league and he'd be playing for maybe even like a playoff team, like a team in the middle of the pack. In LEC, he doesn't even get to play in LEC because as a result, people would rather gamble on the next generation of AD carries, the comps of the world, etc., that they're going to become the great players. Even people like Neon over on, I mean, originally it was SK, but obviously now Schalke. Like, these guys are considered, because of their future, it doesn't matter that maybe their basement level might be as reliable. It was in certain cases, but in theory, before they've ever played in LEC, it's the fact that the ceiling might be higher. So I thought an interesting thought exercise we could do to show this contrast would be, I'm going to take the 4 teams that failed to make the playoffs of LEC. So in theory, the worst teams in LEC. Not quite. I actually think that whole tiebreaker thing, and actually the way Fnatic got in, like, you could argue some of the other teams played more impressively at times, but whatever. In terms of results, the 4 worst performing teams in LEC, and I'm going to take from those 4 teams, so even though they obviously had some certain cases subs like Misfits, potentially we're talking 20 players, I'm going to show you the lineups you could build, real lineups of top, jungle, mid, AD carry support, and how strong they would be even from the 4 failed teams. So what you'll see in that sense is when I contrast that against, I'm going to contrast it against the best LEC teams. You're going to see that there's no wonder the LEC is struggling. There's many other reasons, and actually we discussed this heavily in the most recent episode of Rotations. Some of the more nuanced reasons, more than just the big ones you always hear about. But this is a problem, lack of talent overall, or they haven't been able to develop the same kind of talent. So the 4 teams that failed to make the playoffs was XL, who surprisingly actually had the number of games necessary to make playoffs, but didn't, based on a tiebreaker with Fnatic. What an amazing job by Youngbok. Like, in some ways, it would have been thematically more satisfying if he'd have actually made that slight tiebreak win and gotten in over Fnatic, because in that world, like, that's his former team, the team that ousted him. Certain players were heavily instrumental in that, but he was an amazing coach, and I thought he did amazing things at Fnatic, and with bear in mind what he was working with at XL. In my opinion, the team with arguably the least talent role for role in the whole of the LEC. He had them almost in the playoffs. So listen, there's not as much talent there, but they're one of the teams. Then you go down, you've got Misfits, obviously a team that, if you go back to the spring split, was having some impressive games. People thought they were maybe going to be a team that actually could potentially be a dark horse for the title with how Vebevin and Razork were playing. Denick was starting to look better. Then they got Kobe. They never quite recovered from that. They had some big issues where 2 of the games they lost to Fnatic this split were absolutely pathetic with like enormous leads. One was like an insane gold lead. If they don't lose those games, they're in playoffs as well. So another team that was in the mix at least. Then you've got the teams that, like, realistically, beyond odd games at the beginning of the split, weren't really relevant. So we've got Vitality is the third team, and we're talking second from the bottom here. Obviously, they were putting players in and out at the jungle position. They haven't quite, I mean, some of their players have barely played in LEC, to be fair, and they only just got the mid lane of this split. So understandable on that level, but there's still some problems there. And then the last team, most shocking of all, is OG. Obviously, the team that's now rebranding as Astralis. And if you look at some of their players, they have players that have been like all pro in past years, probably even past splits. So, and one of them, in fact, was voted like the best top laners, might be on the worst team. So, listen, a team with some talent, but it never came together stylistically. And more importantly, I think they basically got mega fucked by the meta, because this was the team that one of their core strengths was actually playing like a late game style where you know what to give up, and more importantly, you can do 1-3-1s, things that like it was very difficult to execute this year. And this team just never came together. They obviously had issues at the support position. I think, despite the fact that Worlds we ended in this farming jungle meta, their farming jungler historically, who's been criticised for that, Cersei, never really got like a chance to play in that regard. And the team just generally was too disconnected. They also had issues behind the scenes as well, including financially, and didn't have the kinds of resources that you might imagine, despite the legacy, the stature of the people that they're supposed to be working with. So from those teams, I mean, let's just think who we've got. So we've got at least 4 names for each position. So we'll start with the classic team that we're going to make, right? So initially, I'll just point out star names, and then we'll try and fit together a team that might even work, like logistically, like might even make sense as a team. So for top lane, the names we've got to consider are, we've got Alfari from OG, we've got Kavashad from Vitality, we've got Dan from Misfits, and we've got that guy Cries or whatever from XL. Now, of these players, this is actually one of the easier ones. There's only 2 I'm even going to consider here, just because they've got the legacy. They've been strong players for many years. They've even been players that have like accomplishments in terms of making playoffs numerous times in their careers, going to Worlds even, and it's going to be Alfari and Kavashad. The obvious one's Alfari, because you could argue, in my opinion, he was the best top laner in the entire West. Take all the LCS teams, all the LEC teams, he was the best. He can play strong side, just barely gets a chance to because of the meta. He could play weak side. He's amazing at it. Every single fucking matchup this guy seemingly has. He always does well in lane. He's always a good player in team fights. Like, what more do you want? Like, the guy's just fantastic. By all accounts, has a great attitude. Never heard any issues about him as a teammate. Like, the sad thing is, I almost get to cheat on this one, because this guy's arguably the best top laner in the entire league. Like I said, in the entire West. And he was on the worst team at the end of the split. And so I can pick him to go on my little superstar team. Thing is, though, that's on current form. If we're going historically, you could also make a strong case for Kavashad. Kavashad has been many of those things Alfari was. Admittedly, he's more of a guy, I think, personally, you want to play through. But there was times in those old Vitality lines where they used to play through the fucking bot lane. So I know this guy's a monster. Very, very strong. Hasn't been as good this year, but the 2 years before that were amazing. I actually think if you look at his body of work, you think how many years he goes back to. This guy was playing in like season 5. I think if you go and look how long this guy's been playing, how long he's been among the best top laners in at least LEC/EU LCS, I think he's actually had a pretty underrated career. It's because he doesn't really have the accomplishments. He doesn't have the finals, the championships, and so as a result, people think individually he must not have been that good, but actually it's the fact he just stuck with Vitality and didn't take any of the other moves and go to other teams. This guy could have been in way better teams. So either of those 2, I'll give you a spoiler right now. Listen, in terms of how a actual proper 5v5 game works, there are certainly metas in which Impact would stand up against these sorts of players. But beyond that, who is there in LCS can even compare to these guys? Someday, yeah, I think Someday is as good, but I also haven't seen him play the quality of top laner and jungler that we have in LEC. So I would really see that in LCS. Beyond that, who are we talking about? Broken Blade, when they play around him in TSM, yeah, he's up there. Not as good as these 2 players. that's about it, guys. Like, there's not really anyone beyond that I really have to consider that's going to be super duper awesome, is there? I mean, there's a reason why just adding Solo, who's like a competent player, was enough to put FlyQuest over the top and make them a potential champion of the LCS. It's a pretty weak role as top lane. That's why Someday ends up just looking like a god there. And Impact doesn't even have to do anything beyond his classic style and just becomes a champion or deep playoff finish every single fucking split of his career. So at top lane, we've already murked the LCS squad that you're going to put towards me. Then let's go to jungle. So obviously we've got OG was Xerxes. Vitality was, I mean, they had a couple of different ones, but spoiler, we're not using any of theirs. Theirs were arguably the worst of all these teams in that regard. XL had Cadril, who I like to listen to talk, but preferred listening to him talk than play. Certainly seems like a smart player, but I've just never seen enough of it in the server that I'd have to put him over some of these names. And then from Misfits, we've got Razork, who obviously had a big pop-off in the spring, had some good games in the summer. But for me, the problem was him and Shadow both came up based on like mechanics and pop-offs. And it's like, I've got to see more than that. For me, that's like one element of being a jungler, but it's not the main one. I don't think it's even the meat and potatoes. I want to see your decision-making, how you play from behind, how you play matchups where you have to take the shit champion in the draft. It's not tailored around you. You're taking what's left or what fits. These are the times that I want to see when you have to play tanks. This is when I know how you work with your mid laner. I want to see these factors before I know how good you are. So I have to say the two names that are obviously jumping off the page here that have to be considered is Razork, and that's mainly about youth and potentially mechanics, etc. But the problem is I haven't seen him with that many players. But form would say you take Razork. If you're going historically, maybe it's in the Kavashad vein here. I know people are going to say for this year, this isn't a name you should consider, which is Cersei. But you know what? During the times when the jungle role was more gank heavy, he did make it work. Like, he reminds me in some senses, people never draw this analog for some reason, but it reminds me a little bit of Meteos at the beginning of Cloud9. Like, he is generally going to somewhat farm more, and he's not going to look for ganks all the time, but it's more like he's looking for ganks that are more of a sure thing. Like, there's a logic, there's a methodology to what Cersei does, in my opinion. And actually, I mean, I thought it in Splice. To me, he was the central part of that team that was able to somewhat neutralise or stop other teams punishing them. It's not that he punishes the other team. He's not like Canavi or something. But he was able to somehow sort of neutralise other teams trying to punish Splice, and then they would get to those bizarre 36-minute games where they would be able to win in the late game, as it's now dubbed. So Cersei would be a strong consideration historically for me. He's actually been a pretty solid jungle. Never been the best, in my opinion, but he's always on the outskirts of that group for splits after split after split, and we're talking about like 3 different teams at this point in time. So yeah, I think actually probably not in good form right now, but a solid plus. If we go to current form, you probably take Razork, but Cersei's not a bad pick either. At mid lane, this is quite an interesting one, because obviously we've got OG has Nukedoc, a classic, veteran, perennial elite player for many years, maybe not at the moment. I think they're taking away his style, unfortunately you can't 1-3-1 much, but classically always been good. You got Febiven from Misfits, at certain points in time, one of Europe's best mid laners, both in terms of laning, in terms of like dueling ability to pop off and carry the game, played in many different regions. Even though he had the bad Misfits speed, he's still a very strong player in this Misfits this year. I'm talking about the Soaz super team from a year ago in that sense. Who else have you got? Obviously, you've got Special over XL. I'm not considering him. I think he was probably the worst at his role. And then over at Vitality, you have Milicia or Milica, whatever they're calling him. Certainly seems to have some potential. I can see why they picked him up out of VRLs. Hasn't had a chance to properly show it yet. This team was something of a mess. I think overall, probably the worst team. I think OG was worse in the sense that look how many wins they got with those players and that talent. But in terms of disparate entities, I think OGC was much better than Vitality. So I'll say he's the worst. I'm going to ignore him completely. So realistically, this is between Febiven and Nukedoc. So current form would say Febiven. Also seems like mentally his mind is in the game and he has a good feel for it. I don't actually think that Nukedoc at the moment, A, suits that jungler, or B, the current meta of the game. But historically, Nukedoc, fantastic player, like a legacy player. Like, once you get beyond the greatest mid laners of all time, which many of them come from Europe, obviously, he's right there. It's like, once you get past Expecin, Caps, and Perks, and Froggen, like these like monster names, the next group of people is like Nukedoc, Febiven, Power of Evil, like they're right there. They're in a similar sort of territory. I know, listen, Nukedoc and Power of Evil don't have the championships Febiven does, but you know what? Febiven also wasn't always the main carrier of that team, wasn't always the central reason they won. So I think they're comparable, certainly, and the others obviously have very long careers, whereas Featherman doesn't have quite as long a career. Neither does Power of Evil as Nuke Dog. So I don't think it's as easy as people think there. But I would choose in current form Featherman. It looks like he's a more confident player. Looks like he can play even with lesser teammates. He's overcome a lot of his issues. Nuke Dog's not a bad pick. You're just going to have to rehabilitate him. But I tell you what, we're also talking about contrast with LCS. Put these guys in LCS, my lord. They're going to fucking tear it up. I know everyone's going to go, Featherman was in LCS. Yeah, the first split, he was fucking good. He was on the clutch gaming team that beat TSM. Are you all forgetting that or something? Listen, by the summer, yeah, he was somewhat mailing it in. But quite frankly, I think the GMing and the coaching of that team was fucking garbage. I know actually the coach went on to do good things later, but that was years after the fact. Probably learned some lessons from that team. I don't think they used Featherman very well. What we've seen about Featherman is, if you put him in a team where he doesn't seem comfortable or he doesn't fuck with like the mentality of his teammates, I do think he can go off the boil and he can sort of lose interest or just mail it in a little bit. That's why I found it very interesting that he was bigging up B-Voy so much when B-Voy was his AD carry in the spring, because I don't think it's that B-Voy was actually amazing. I think it's just that Featherman saw the guy's like hard-working, got a good mindset, like he's trying to improve. I think those are the things that won Featherman over, and there's something to be learned about his character in listening to how he talked about those players. So Featherman, great pickup in that case. For the bot lane, we actually have some pretty solid talent here. Like, amazingly, AD carry is such a stacked role right now that all 4 of the AD carries deserve some level of consideration. So for OG, we've got Upset. Listen, Upset has been hailed on terms of raw talent and critical acclaim. Arguably the best AD carry or a contender for it. Pretty much every split, maybe even including this one. Like every year for the last 2 or 3 years, he's been a contender or he has been the best AD carry. It depends what you want to say. Like I thought he carried that fucking Schalke team, even though he had some issues in the playoffs. On this OG team, he looked like one of the best pieces on the team. He just couldn't get activated at times, or the meta just meant that like it's not going to 1v9 from AD carry, is he? And he had no fucking support for most of the year. So Upset immediately got to consider. I know Kobe just had the terrible time in LCS, but that's because his team didn't understand his fundamental fucking identity as a player and just misused him. And also, I will say, in terms of his personality, he doesn't seem like a guy who's going to speak up. I think he just took it when he was basically being put in positions that weren't good for him, which isn't great, but if you know that, you can sort of tailor the team around him. But clearly, nice skills, and especially if you put him in a team where you're going to play heavily through top and mid, Kobe will carry those late game team fights. He's a very competent player in that regard. I consider him sort of like Reckless Light, which is not even a diss, by the way. It's just to categorise what he's like as a player and how I model him. Then you go over to, obviously you have Patrick in XL. Now, this is another one where people might not be aware of this, but the behind-the-scenes sort of experts' take is that you could argue Patrick was the best ADC as well. That's what's crazy. The 2 best ADCs in the LEC for this split might actually have been 2 who didn't make the playoffs. It wasn't Kazi or... I mean, I don't mind the Reckless pick if you want that one, but I also think he had some just okay games. Like, the problem with him is when his team's going well, he looks fantastic, but some of the other ones he was just all right in. But he certainly didn't have many bad games. But obviously this isn't picking Reckless. He's already made the playoffs. He was in the finals. Patrick, I think, is a very strong shout, though. To me, that's the miracle that Youngbuck worked. The only world-class piece he had was Patrick, and that was debatable. And this guy was potentially going to beat out massively teams that show overstacked in terms of players, like OG and Fnatic, and he was going to beat them and make the playoffs. Fucking hell, mate. So I think you've got to consider Patrick. Obviously, lack of experience, though, hasn't been to Worlds deep in playoffs typically in his career. He's had the odd run to like semis, etc. That's it. Certainly looks like he's in his strongest form right now, though. He was the main reason XL won most of those games this split. And then the last name, I just have to throw him in because he has actually had some decent games, is Comp, the AD carry of Vitality. So for AD carry, you can take any of these 4. For me, experience mixed with overall strength. Now, like, I'm probably going to take Upset of these 4. I think, like, the problem is Upset and Patrick, like, it's kind of a push in terms of form, but Upset has the experience. He's played in different teams. He's played when he's the main carry. He's played when he's a secondary or tertiary carry. He's played with all different kinds of support, shit ones, okay ones, underrated ones, like good ones. Like, he's played with them all. So in my opinion, you've got to take Upset out of this group. But I wouldn't hate it if someone takes Patrick. And if you have the right team, you can take Kobe, certainly. Now, for support, there's only really 2 I'm considering for this. Like, I'm only really going to consider Denick from Misfits, who didn't even get to play most of the split, or Tor, formerly known as Noskaren, from XL, because I think those players, when they were in proper lineups, like in the spring for Denick, and obviously Tor and XL, I think they actually did a pretty decent job in their team. Probably Denick probably isn't underrated because everyone was crying for him to replace DOS. I think people get it that he has some potential. He just wasn't with the right ADC before. And for some weird reason, they just didn't want to pair him with Kobe for this split until towards the end. And Tor, listen, people are going to say Patrick carries him, but I saw this guy do a pretty good job when he was with Kobe as well. Like, I think he's a competent LEC player. He's not a bad player. He's not a really good player. He's just a competent player. He's never going to be bad, I don't think. And Denick, I actually think has some potential to one day be potentially, like we're talking, like top 4, top 5 support. So I think for support, the obvious pick is Denick. I don't think Tor's like experience dwarfs what he's done. I think in terms of form from when I've only seen him play like a split and a half, basically, or slightly less. But Denick looked pretty quality, and if you put him with a good AD carry, like I'd love to see him with Upset or Patrick, etc. Obviously even Kobe, but I only got to see that for a few games. So if you consider the talents here, like let's just be real. I can literally pick, like, let's say I pick like the team based on the ones I was going with the most likely. So I would pick like Alfari, Razork, because I'm going to go current form, Febiven, Upset, and Denick. Right? If you look at that 5-man lineup, I don't even say compare me to all of LCS. Compare me to the best. Compare me to the top 4 teams in LCS. So I'll say the 3 that went to Worlds, TSM, FlyQuest, Team Liquid. But you know what? Throw in the 4th one, Cloud9, because one of the problems with comparing the World's results to how good the region is loads of the best players, the all-pro players, were fucking in Cloud9. They didn't go to Worlds. So that's obviously going to skew it and make it one of your worst results ever, isn't it? It's like the year when the KT Super Team didn't go to Worlds, or when Griffin didn't go to Worlds. Like, some of the best players in your region just sat fucking at home. Just like, by the way, spoiler for anyone who hasn't been following LPL, Rookie is still a clear top 5 mid laner, arguably top 5 player in the entire world. But he sat at home watching Worlds, because that's the way Worlds works, sadly, with the slots, etc. If this was Dota or CSGO, and that was TI or the Major, he'd be at that tournament, because his team would be good enough to qualify, and he is a good enough player. So whatever, that's just a side point. So now you look at my names I've put down there. Right, I can literally have top mid in ADC potentially be world-class players, because I can have Alfari, absolutely an amazing player, could contrast with some of the best Asians. Febiven or Nukeduck and Pastures, Febiven when he's at his peak, certainly right up there with some of the best mids. Listen, he isn't BDD, Chovy, those are the gods. But you know what, once you make like a top 20 mids in the world, like he could be borderline top 10 when he's in the right team and in good form. In fact, clearly top 10 when he's in really good form, in my opinion. He can do some of the things that Caps can do. AD Carry, Upset, Patrick, these are quality players. Like, listen, they're not quite as good as their Asian counterparts rather, but they're still very strong players. So I can have all 3 of my main laning roles be really strong. Way better, by the way, individually and collectively, than LCS. You can find me a mid laner who's as good as Febiven, as good as Nukeduck. You can maybe, especially with the imports, find me a top who's as good as Alfari. When Doubleth was in his prime and Sven's doing really well, you can find me an AD carry who's sort of as good. But the point is, you can't find me all 3 in one team. That doesn't exist in NA. And so, look at what options I have. I have either an amazing weak side top laner or a strong side top laner, so I can pick either side there. Amazing. I've got tons of options at AD carry. Experience, current form, like potential, everything. I can pick for everything. And my mid, a very minimum, has banging experience. Then look at my other elements. I can have a jungle and support who have shown solid promise. I can have like Razork, Cersei, could well improve in terms of Razork, in terms of the support. If I have Denick, solid promise, could well improve. If I have to pick a coach, I mean, of these teams, I would easily pick Youngbuck. Guy's a fucking miracle worker, does so much with so little. If you give him a lot, he can do a lot. This guy's one of the best coaches I've ever seen in esports. So if we contrast this with LCS, like, first of all, I think my lineup could fucking win the LCS. I mean, just look how complete it is, how well-rounded it is, how there's a mixture of strong players now, experience, current form, promise, potential, all the styles. I can play through all my lanes in theory. Like, this is a fucking fantastic set of players. I don't think anyone can match the strength of my laners. And the supportive elements, as a result, would have a fucking field day. Listen, Core JJ is better than Denick or Tor, but Core JJ has Broxer as his jungler. My guy's going to have a good jungler and a good support. We've already got the open, and then we've got all the laners. Like, I actually do think, on paper, this LEC failures team wins LCS. It's the best. It shows like the difference in raw talent across the region, and especially how much it's spread out. Because obviously Cloud9's got a load of talent in one team. TL, in theory, TSM have got a load of talent in one team. Once you start to go to the other rosters, the FlyQuest, Draster, I mean, if you go past that, like the EG roster, some of these players aren't that great. Yeah, some of them are just okay players. So I think also LCS has stacked a lot of the talent into just a few teams, contrasted with the LEC has a nice variety just spread all across the league. Now, I will say at the end, this is just shadow boxing. This is a hypothetical. This is a thought exercise. It's not actually as simple as that. Like, if you could really make that lineup, first of all, they obviously couldn't play in LCS because of the import rules. But even if there was no import rules, it's also not as simple as saying because they're good players and individually they're good, you can put them into a team, put them in LCS and they would actually win. Because actually, I think that assumption that if you're sick in EU or LEC, you will go to LEC and be even better or style on them even more or haha smurfing on them, like, that doesn't happen as often as you think. It's actually a mixed bag. Like, some do. Sometimes the ones that aren't even as good in Europe. Sometimes they're monsters in Europe and are some of the best players ever and they're just okay. Or they have like a one good split in LCS. I might even do a future video about that because I think there's a lot of like external or secondary consideration factors which are why that is. That isn't just about the game. It doesn't matter that you think the region's worse, the style of how they play, how you practice, etc., what your current environment's like, I think has a massive effect on it. But if you just look at the talent I've picked out here, man alive, this is what makes LEC look much stronger than LCS. This video was kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Pronogo, Alexander Rao, Andreas Kroknes, ErikHillestad, Hades, JDubs, the Puyallup Tribe, Tobias Bernasconi, VatriSam, Xinged, James Pederson, and as always, a special thanks goes out to my boy Jerky's Minion. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Do you want to ask a question in my monthly video AMA? Do you want teasers? See who the upcoming guests are going to be? Maybe you'd like to take part in one of those monthly donated discussions with me about esports. Well, put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrolluminati today in the Patreon link in the description box below.